your invitation first. I have to say that I'm feeling very illegitimate. I must say, I'm a lawyer. I'm not a philosopher, but in fact, I must say that it's the kindness and generosity and also the hospitality of Bernard Stiegler that for some time has made me feel a little bit less illegitimate in that indisciplinary work, indisciplinary rather than interdisciplinary, I must say, work that I'm trying to do. So I thank you. I thank the organizer for reconducting that generosity and welcoming through your kind invitation to speak here. So I will speak of course, of algorithmic governmentality because it's on that theme that I encounter Bernard Stiegler, and on the occasion of that work that we had the occasion to speak, and I had the chance to know him a little bit more. I don't know Bernard very well. I'm not an intimate, but he has been a companion for my thought, and not having him in the background, knowing that he will not listen to me, is something quite disturbing. He's so present in my mind that I have the impression that he has always only been that he said to us that, well, I have to go now, but I will come back later. So my speak is waiting for. I'm still waiting for Bernard's response, and I'm sure reading his tertiary retentions, I will find a lot of objections to what I am trying to present here. So I'll speak of algorithmic governmentality and try to go a little bit further than the point of conversation where we left it with Bernard. Of course, just to remind you, in the hypothesis of algorithmic governmentality, digital data are no longer apprehended as secondary instances or retentions, representing or conveying pre-existing entities, subject, object, truth, activities, intentions, power and domination relationships. They are not taken as signifiers, as signs. Data are not even stigma or evidence of anything, but rather they are pure decontextualized, dehistoricized, asemantic but computable signals, exempting from any sensitive relationship to the world and its inhabitants. By establishing a regime of indistinction between digital signals and things, algorithmic governmentality and the digital behaviorism it implements bypasses hermeneutic criticism. Algorithmic analysis of digital signals, that is, the automated transformation of deterritorialized digital signals into operational knowledge, is the preferred mode of production of the real. And in fact, I would relate this abstraction, because I would say that the problem of algorithmic governmentality for us is much less hyper-control than hyper-abstraction and hyper-delocalization. Michel Foucault's warning in 1964, he warned already against the retreat of hermeneutics into semiology, which we would call seismography, as it concerns the detection of pure digital signals rather than signs. Foucault already said that hermeneutics and semiology, or I would say seismography, are two fierce enemies. A hermeneutics that withdraws into semiology believes in the absolute existence of signs, or I would say rather signals in this case. It abandons violence, the unfinished, the infinity of interpretations to make the terror of the clue, or indice, indice in French, reign, and to suspect language. So in algorithmic governmentality, we are placed right away in the constantly proliferating digital universe, which thus appears as a map that would itself produce its own territory, a purely speculative territory of opportunities and risks. What algorithms do, they don't produce images of the world, they rather disconfigure, disaggregate, overcome all our images and produce purely speculative spaces of risks and opportunities. While this algorithmic realism, which we can say also has a lot to do with speculative realism in philosophy, algorithmic realism replaces any production of truth with continuous learning, machine learning, that can only be envisaged against the background of what is usually stated as the boundary of the jurisdiction of Western rationality: contingency, error, incompleteness are not limits to algorithmic realism. They are the condition, the precondition, and the presupposition of algorithmic realism. By contingency, I mean that no formula can summarize the anarchic proliferation of data. By error, I mean that the condition of feedback, which produces difference and therefore learning, can, rather than sterile reinforcement, is absolutely necessary for a machine to learn anything. By incompleteness, I mean that the meaning of data is always deferred, is always not already there, always to come. And this is for the reason that, the reason of recursivity, and it's always deferred by the ever open prospect of new correlations with data still to be collected. So that's the new semiotic or epistemic, epistemic without epistemology, where we are plunged now. Now, of course, one cannot look at that independently from capitalism. I think, in fact, that there is an important homology between the functioning of capitalism and the functioning of algorithmic governmentality. As reminded, for example, by Mark Fisher and many others, capitalism persists and proliferates no longer by persuading anyone of its merits and virtues, but rather by dissolving collective schemes of recalcitrance to it. Up to the fact that, well, it has become today easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And in fact, Bernard Stiegler himself has said and has written that capitalism must not be overcome. Capitalism must not be overcome, and algorithmic technology and algorithmic governmentality must not be overcome, but tamed and adopted. And that may be one of the biggest disagreements I share with Bernard. In the same way as capitalism, although sometimes supported by discourses resurrecting the idea of progress and calling the cultural, legal, and ethical reluctance to surrender to the new technical ideology of Dataism obstacles to overcome under the infamous threat of lagging behind, algorithmic governmentality, especially in the papers proliferating from the European Union, from European Commission, from white papers and so on, algorithmic governmentality no longer presents itself as an alternative to other forms of government, but as their inevitable destiny. In these mainstream discourses, expected societal benefits of algorithmic governmentality, or more popular, more popular terms, artificial intelligence, are depicted in the most promising yet absolutely evasive terms, and regardless of the variety and materiality of social, cultural, economic, ecological context and localities. The diversity of concerned practices urged to convert to AI, adopt AI, appears explicitly as a universal requirement for governments, companies, and individuals whose literally blind trust is expected on the understanding that AI will boost productivity, efficiency, and operationality, enhance quality and safety of life, bypass human intervention and judgment. In this perspective, as Julia Pauls and Helen Nissenbaum rightfully observed, the strategic concession that algorithmic processes may raise issues of fairness, accountability, but also that these issues are amendable to computational fixes, which consist in formalizing fairness as computer-readable constraint or correcting data and metrics accordingly, running a variety of retro-engineering and other tests. This strategic concession, consisting in reducing and abstracting systemic and social structural inequalities and opacities into by design, everything by design. We speak of a fat algorithm, meaning fair, accountable, and transparent algorithms. Making, in fact, fairness, accountability, and transparency properties of black boxes rather than properties of the wider social, cultural, economic life we inhabit. So these technological fixes, in fact, appear like counterfactual renunciation to judgment of materiality, of concrete situations, to the benefit of, what has to be judged today is the algorithm. We govern algorithms and we cease governing the world. So AI ethics, much popularized today. If you make a research project and you put AI ethics in the title, you are almost sure to gain a lot of money with that. AI ethics is worthy only as a means to obtain trust and as sole supplements supposed to reinforce the attractiveness and competitivity of artificial intelligence made in Europe. Sorry, I have a little interrupter. Sorry about that. That intempestivity of life. Things go as if AI infrastructure itself was not something worthy of collective deliberation, but something that imposed itself as our new state of nature. The algorithmic turn doesn't appear, or rather isn't presented to us as a matter of social choice, but as our unquestionable, unavoidable horizon. Artificial intelligence is already part of our life. It's not science fiction. From using a virtual personal assistant to organizing our working day, to traveling in a self-driving vehicle, to our phone suggesting songs or restaurants that we might like, AI is a reality. That comes from the European Commission's white paper. It's a reality. The status of reality of AI immunizes its deployment from public deliberation and critique. Who indeed would be crazy enough to question reality? This naturalization of AI makes it appear independent of social choices. Indeed, no mention or suggestion is ever made that citizens, might have to pronounce themselves on the desirability of a dystocial world colonized and managed by algorithms. In the European strategy of AI, the notion of citizen has become soluble in this notion of the user and consumers, and pleasing user consumers apparently dispenses of empowering citizens as individual and collective political subjects. Force-fed with digital apps allowing for hyper-individualized and optimization of their personalized milieu, citizens are in this respect absolutely expropriated from deliberative space-time. Embracing change, encouraging uptake of AI by the public and private sectors are the explicit motto, at least of the European Commission. The word adoption has ambiguous connotations. On the website of Ars Industrialis, adoption is a term that derives from ad optare, which means to opt or choose, to graft or acquire. I read Ars Industrialis. Every human individuation is a process of adoption, and the health of an individuation is measured by its adoptability of a way of life, a technique, an idea, a stranger, etc., and by its ability to adopt. The making one sound that is adoption presupposes a participation of what is adopted in what is adopted. Adoption is the process of individuation, that means enrichment, while adaptation is de-individuation, a restriction of the individual's possibilities. Adapting to a norm is not adopting a norm. In the first case, the norm is set independently of the person adapting. In the second, the norm only exists if it is adopted. Adaptation is a relationship between two terms that pre-exist when they are related, whereas adoption is a relationship through such that the terms do not pre-exist when they are related. The latter is creative of the terms it relates. For example, the father and his child do not as such pre-exist to the adoption relationships. So in the European Commission's policies, and in trends with current trends in digital innovation, these new applications and utilities promising to make individuals' daily life more comfortable, their actions and interactions more efficient, their environment safer and more responsive in real time to their inferred needs, mimic, I don't know, adaptation or adoption, much more adaptation than adoption, I think. An adaptation of AI, and but more so because of the preemptive systems of detection, preemptive detection of needs and desires and so on. It's a mutual adaptation rather than mutual adoption. Comfort, efficiency, safety, and responsiveness are all user-consumer-centric, of course, whereas user-consumers are targeted not so much in their capacity of reflexive citizens, but as bundles of pulsions, awaiting to be satisfied and infinitely renewed. Pleasing the user-consumer amounts to satisfy his or her drives or compulsions in real time. According to this vision, blind vision, I would say, individuals live satisfied, each enclosed in his or her own techno-cocoon. In the age of smartphones, social networks, ambient intelligence, physical isolation from those who are physically present in the same place, but not only, or social distanciation, is not the manifestation of a state of exception, but the habitual precondition to connection to others through social networks and others. That's Sherry Turkle spoke about that already quite a long time ago. Confrontation with others and revisions of one's own preferences in a deliberative public space, a space where one is exposed to things that have not been customized to fit each person's profile, a space of deliberation about matters of collective concerns, irreducible to the mere juxtaposition and maximization of individual interests, appear so old-fashioned and ineffective, isn't it? There is no need for politics when one has big data and algorithms. So goes the dominant hegemonic technopolitical imaginary of the time. So goes the data science fiction, hyperfiction, hyper-abstraction. The technological ideology of big data or data behaviorism doesn't legitimate capitalism. Hegemony would de facto render the already there hegemony of capitalism would de facto render such legitimation dispensable and useless. In fact, what it does, by virtue of its apprehension of the world in real time and in high definition, which is also high dissolution, high resolution dissolution, it immunizes capitalist flaws from everything that should urgently, otherwise and necessarily, tame them. The world in excess of digital reality, or the incompressible portion of radical uncertainty, the excess of material possibility over probability, the human individual and collective subjects as processes of individuation, and life itself as having alteration as at its principles. And there is no alternative, apparently. The question, though, would be what governing and instituting could still mean, if anything at all, in a world of massive data populated by artificial intelligence and in which life, both human and non-human, translates into dynamic aggregates of digital mass processed on an industrial scale. And this is a question particularly pressing for lawyers, as for Western law at least. The question translated for a lawyer, and I'm a lawyer, so I translate for myself. Sorry about that. The question would be how, and in the name of what, can and should Western law, the result of a long and slow linguistic sedimentation in a civilization of sign and text, accommodate, accompany, or frame, limit, or even name a digital revolution that is on the verge of tipping us over into a civilization of asemantic but computable digital signals, a civilization of the algorithm. In other words, how could the anthropological function of law, according to the formulation given by Alain Suppiot, that is, making each one of us a homo juridicus, and Alain Suppiot said that making each of us an homo juridicus is the Western way of linking the biological and symbolic dimensions that make up the human being. How can such anthropological function of the law coexist with a cybernetic perspective, according to which the biological dimension, like the symbolic dimension and social dimension of human existence, would no longer be apprehended except as pure flows of computable data updated in real time? It is, I suggest in other works, in the name of a triple disadjustment that law performs, a triple distanciation that law renders operational. The triple disadjustment is guaranteed and guarantees also the rule of law. It guarantees that the legal world should produce reluctance towards algorithmic governmentality. Against digital behaviorism, the law affirms a difference, a distinction, between people and their behaviors, based on and guaranteeing the person as a process in constant surpassing, overcoming of itself. The judge never judge a person. He always judge behaviors. And behaviors are irreducible, and the person is irreducible to its behavior, his behaviors. Against the claim of exhaustiveness conveyed by a technical ideology of big data, the rule of law and the constitutions spare the distant, the people to come, which is that which is not yet there, that which has not yet given rise to any digital recording, heterogeneity, or recording. That means the rule of law and constitutions in particular, then in French we say ménage, it allows for taking into consideration of things and materialities, even future materialities and people and beings to come, which have not yet had the opportunity to leave digital traces because they are not already existent and have not behaved in any way yet. So that's the specific openness of law that is allowed also by a third disadjointment, which is the disadjointment between law, written law, and justice. Justice is irreducible to law. Justice is the principle of the principle of perfectibility of the state of fact. So that this adjustment between justice and law is also this adjustment pointed by Bernard Stiegler between l'état de fait et l'état de droit. So for that reason, the difference between algorithmic governmentality, which optimizes and thus closes the state of fact, however unsustainable this may be, the rule of law thwarting and renewing its own incompleteness and incalculability is an ever renewed, inextinguishable promise of contestability. The question, the question then was this one: how can we? It's a question that also was asked by Bernard. Another question is: could we make a world at the interface, at the interstice between machines and humans? Is there a possibility to make a world at the interface or at the intersection of the organic and the machinic that would amount to a recomposition of individual and collective subjectivities within new technical scientific contexts and new geopolitical coordinates, as Félix Guattari called for in his 3 ecologies? Of course, there are possibilities. Of course, but not if one follows the dominant Dataism, which closes the digital on itself. The imperialism of data science will not do the job. Instead, what is needed is indeed an environmental, social, and mental ecology, which Félix Guattari calls an ethico-political ecosophy. That ethical political philosophy is particularly difficult to imagine and to put in practice in current situation, given the weight and the ubiquity of Dataism, or the belief in the new disinstitution of society through data, or imaginary disinstitution of society that is corresponds to algorithmic governmentality, or the success of algorithmic governmentality. Whereas digital capitalism and algorithmic governmentality to remind you, unlike previous forms of governmentality identified by Michel Foucault, capture life forms not as subjects, as would pastoral power, nor as processes of subjectivation or subjection, as would disciplinary power, nor as populations affected by overall phenomena, as would biopolitics, but merely as fragmented bundles of indifferent and infinitely recombinable pre-semiotic signals or data points in a purely speculative geometric space. It doesn't merely foreclose ecosophical perspectives of Guattari, it also makes the more classical questions of critique and thus politics appear irrelevant. And that's another challenge, in fact. Although algorithmic governmentality appears at first sight to implement and materialize and make arise all that Guattari, Deleuze, Foucault appeared to call for. That's the revenge of the plane of immanence over the plane of organization, a kind of immanentization, and a regulation that would follow the normativity of, or normativity that would follow the normativity of life itself rather than unclosing life in pre-existing categories and hierarchies. In fact, critique appears really a problem. How to rethink critique today? Challenging or escaping the categories and perceived universalities through which one is predisposed to perceive the world, the typical work of critique, is indeed obsolete, as the rise of Dataism makes the very idea of resilient categories or universalities appear as mere oldies anyway. That's one of the reasons why the most of the time leftist movements still committed to resisting to overarching categorization and authorities which have anyway already been horizontalized and immanentized by the replacement of government by governance, are struggling to find effective political strategies against digital capitalism. Thanks to machine learning algorithms, the agility of algorithmic governmentality, detecting, evaluating, anticipating, and modulating conducts according to eminently plastic metrics, evolving according to the behaviors of all others, that replaces antecedent dogmaticity and selectivity of previous modes of categorization and disciplinary strategies of power. Ideally generated by algorithms alone, with as little human intervention as possible, functioning as unmediated seismographs of the digitized social rather than the conventional benchmarks, often criticized as resulting from power struggles. Agile metrics appear to replace strategies or finalities.
Sorry, the time is over. Could you please wrap up soon?
Yes.
Because yes, thank you.
Okay. So the algorithmic capacity to translate discrete data points that would have, under previous statistical episteme, been discarded from calculation and considered as noise rather than as signals into surplus value without intervention of human intelligence in its dimensions of sensibility, rationality, and imagination is just a hallmark of digital capitalism. Digital capitalism mistakenly then appears emancipatory in a way, as it allows discrete pre-semiotic singularities, not singularities, but particularities, to count rather than be discarded. Yet, this technical reproduction of immanence, to say it with Paolo Vignola, or the radically uninhabited algorithmic semiosis produced from disparate data points does not leave any space-time, any suspension time, for processes of subjectivation or individuation to happen. As Jacques Derrida already noted, It is precisely the power of difference that is inherent in the power of difference to change life less and less as it expands. If it were to become infinite difference, which is its essence excludes a priori, life itself would be rendered to an impassive, intangible, and eternal presence. Infinite difference, God or death. So, as to wrap up, we are in a bad, in quite a bad situation. It's a real nihilism, as Bernard Stiegler said. So the critical question, and I will finish with that very soon, the critical question then, instead of resistance and so on, the critical question, which is also essentially a political question, is this one. What are the conditions for us, living entities of the same planet, to become the people? To reaffirm that we exist as the people in excess of our own presence, in excess of digital patterns and profiles, despite the hypertelic proliferation of data and the rise of algorithmic irrationality, despite the new agility of data-driven power to domesticate little differences or to tame the multitudes. Against the pure presence of data, we exist as the people through our political imagination and fabulation. We exist as processes of individuation in collective assemblages of enunciation, and the technology of enunciation is language. As Pierre Legendre reminds us, language is an operation of exchange in the sense that it connects and holds together through the third term, through the gap that underlies it, two opposing and interdependent registers. In other words, the linguistic operations involve the active exchange between materiality and its indefinite construction in representation. Thus specified, this holding together designates exactly what we call, in a no blunt term, symbolization. So the alleged digital transparency of the social world promoted by the ideology of big data produces vast area of symbolization and unspeakability. And against that, what is really needed, just as is to make count, to make appear what is absolutely neglected, which is the world itself in its materiality. Existing as the people implies a reclamation to reclaim the virtual, that is, to reclaim our essential heterochronicity as living organisms and social beings, and our capacity to transcend the deadly injunction compulsion of never-ending optimization, reclaiming our power not to be where we are expected to be, and the power not to do all we are capable to do, reclaiming that kind of reticence, recalcitrance, is a way to reach space-time for political flourishing, not predated by digital capitalism. So, writing that today or reading that today, I realize it may appear a little bit pointless, as it appears that we are all already in an ugly sea of digital capitalism, gradually devouring the shores. Nobody can accept itself from such hegemony, but through inventions of something else, in excess or adopting a crepe gates in parallel of this totality without outside. There we are, already up to the neck in the water, trying to learn, like birds trying to swim or fish trying to fly. That's writing. We take a last, or not the last, but the 4 last puff of heterochronic dream before drawing, so to say, and in an attempt or a call to make it last. A call to keep open the possibility of new material practices on the ground and alternative collective fabulations that would make us consist as people. Not nostalgia, but melancholy maybe. Melancholy is not always nostalgic. As Mark Fisher powerfully argued, we need to build a critique from a future that has not arisen. That future, for sure, is not in the data, is not in the sheltering sky, illusory sheltering sky of the data clouds. Even if it's not so open. Yes, I will finish. I will finish by saying that the ecographies of the future that algorithmic predictions are often equated with are nothing but purely speculative spaces of risks and opportunities. As such, they say nothing about the future. They are neither true or false. The future is something we just have to invent by ourselves, by living with our own disappointment. And thank you very much. Sorry for having been a bit long.